I would support that.
Moving on to questions about the parole board, you'll be familiar with the recent case of Colin Pitchfork.
Yeah.
Can you understand why there might be, without obviously being able to comment on the specifics of the case, can you understand why there'd be public concern about a very serious, one of the most serious offenders being released and so quickly having grounds to be recalled to prison?
Yes.
And I guess that leads on to what you...
Although in one sense, at least, I think I hope people would feel at the same time at least partially reassured that he is back inside, and that suggests that the radar and the tripwires that are put in place were effective. I appreciate will also beg the question of whether he should have been released in the first place.
I think it's the proximity to the release which might lend it more towards the latter concern than the prior one. In terms of your reforms for the parole board, can I just check, I understand, is that work been done in terms of the internal review and it's just for ministerial consideration, or is there for plans of reviewing the parole board?
So obviously when you come in as a new Secretary of State, you want to look at it very carefully. I've got some very clear views as to what should happen, so I want to get it right, not quick. I'm not going to disclose the direction of work because I don't think that's particularly helpful, other than to say I think at the moment, if you look at, and I have no criticism of the parole board in terms of the criteria that they work to and the legal framework, I think if you look at it at the moment, particularly for the high-risk cases, and of course there's a whole load of work the parole board do that doesn't really touch the public's consciousness, but at the high level, the severe cases, and also cases where the question of risk is very finely balanced, I think one of the interesting things and issues that I want to address very squarely is that effectively the presumption is in relation, it drives in the direction of release unless it is demonstrated that there's risk. I think there's a good question about whether the presumption should be that way. For me, if you look at what we've been doing on climate change, we talk an environmental regulation, we talk a lot about a precautionary principle. It's a very good question about whether, in relation to the highest risk offenders that go before a parole board, there ought to be changes which reflect that. And I think we also need some humility, because when you're measuring risk, you can get as many different reports going in, trying to gauge whether it's from the social worker, those that are involved in the prison regime, right the way through the full spectrum. But measuring risk is inherently difficult, and it is not a science. And therefore, I think we've just got to be honest about that. And that's what leads me to take a more precautionary approach. I suspect that's something that, to touch on your earlier point, the public would like to see.
It's interesting because one of the other things we've looked at is the IPP sentences, and some of the evidence we've heard is that that's almost living that precautionary principle. You kind of have to prove that you're not going to reoffend, that can create problems in the other direction. People who are originally sentenced for quite low sentences ending up in prison for a very, very long time, long past their index sentence, because they're not able to prove that they're not a risk. Would you accept that as a consequence and say, well, that's what might happen and we have to live with that, or would that concern you?
I think they're different considerations, but in truth, the IPPs have been reformed going forward, and we've got an action plan for trying to strike the right balance. And you're right that there is a risk there, but I would just also point to the fact that as of the end of September, beginning of October, we were down to something like 1,661 IPP prisoners who haven't been released. It was over 6,000 at its peak. So it feels to me that without taking risks, adhering to a more precautionary approach, you can strike the right balance. But look, at my job, I think our job as a government is to protect the public. And in relation to these either very dangerous cases or very high risk and finding and difficult to gauge the extent of risk after a considerable period of time in incarceration, I think we've got to show some humility that is incredibly difficult, and I would prefer to err on the side of public protection. I say that about all of these kinds of cases.
Okay, that's a really helpful insight into one feature of reform. Are there any others that you fresh in your mind about what you see might change?
I think that for now just gives you a sense of my direction of travel. Of course, I want to look at it properly and consider, as you rightly say, all the implications.
Okay. Moving on quickly to talk about Harper's Law.